And in this image, all of the orange and red spots in the images are cells that are dying. Hey guys, so in this video I will be discussing whether steroids themselves are neurotoxic. We see so much in our community about steroids and brain health, but I want to address the actual molecular mechanisms behind whether steroids firstly are actually neurotoxic and bad for your brain, and then why certain compounds seem to be worse than others, like tren. And the reason I put so much effort into all of these videos is because I do honestly believe that the more education out there, the safer you can be, especially with younger guys who are in this new generation of taking gear as early as possible. If the science is murky and they just blindly follow what's out there on Instagram, then I honestly believe they'll be hurting their health more. So I try and get as much education out there so that if you do decide to go down that route, you do have all the information that you need to be able to make a more informed decision and overall have better judgment about bodybuilding and your health in general. So to start, we need to look at steroids overall and how they actually influence brain chemistry. And there's evidence that they don't just act on androgen receptors in the brain, but GABA receptors as well, and influence GABAergic transmission. The central region of the medial preoptic area, the medial preoptic nucleus, is characterized by a dense presence of GABAergic neurons and GABA-A receptors, as well as high levels of androgen receptors, estrogen receptors, and aromatase. And this area of the brain in particular seems to have a high steroid affinity. Now, this is really interesting because it's this area that actually is involved in sexual behavior and modulates a lot of our social behaviors. And in this study was shown to be vastly different in regulating male versus female sexual behavior. So with that information in mind, it's really important to see how androgens influence this part of the brain, and therefore we can start to determine whether certain compounds are actually worse for your brain chemistry and more neurotoxic than others. So the first way that steroids influence actual cellular mechanisms in the brain is through something called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. So a lot of our cellular processes rely on calcium, and androgens raise calcium levels and calcium ion concentrations in nerve transmission. And this seems to be the link between neurotoxicity and steroids. Now, interestingly, studies have shown that at physiological levels, testosterone is actually protective of cells and neuroprotective, inducing survival and growth of cells, but it's high dose androgens that are the issue. Basically, what happens is high dose androgens and certain compounds like trenbolone can prolong calcium signaling and lead to a higher influx of calcium into a cell, which can basically overwhelm the cell and lead to programmed cell death or apoptosis. And neurons in our brain die off this way as a result of excessive calcium influx through the cells. In this study, very high levels of testosterone were found to enhance cell death, whereas, like I said, intermediate to lower levels of physiological testosterone didn't seem to induce any significant death. And like I always say on this channel, the science does back this up, that estrogen is protective, and in this study, estrogen was found to protect cell death when high levels of androgens were administered. And further studies have shown that more powerful steroids with higher anabolic to androgenic ratios like nandrolone, D-bol, 17-alpha-methyl testosterone, androsterone, all of these steroids induce significant cell death through these apoptotic pathways. Now, when a cell programs itself to die, a protein called caspase-3 appears in its active form. And in the study I'm just talking about, this protein, caspase-3, was only present in its active form in neuron cells that were treated with high levels of anabolic androgenic steroids, and basically suggesting that cell death is a result of these high dose steroids. So that's pathway one. And the second pathway in which steroids can be neurotoxic is through the generation of reactive oxygen species. And basically, no matter if you're natty or not, ROS, reactive oxygen species, can contribute to cell death. And there does seem to be an interesting split here. Treating cells with androgens before exposure to ROS seemed to protect them. Treating them with steroids after exposure to ROS really seemed to induce death a lot quicker, suggesting that androgens are neuroprotective when oxidative stress levels are low, but when oxidative stress levels are elevated, androgens worsen the oxidative damage and contribute to more cell death than you would otherwise see. And this is evidence that it is the oxidative stress level that determines whether androgens are going to be neurotoxic or not. Basically, androgens may protect against moderate oxidative stress, but not when levels are high. Now, this is very relevant to people who are pushing hard in the gym, bodybuilders, top-level competitive bodybuilders, where they have a lot of chronic inflammation and reactive oxygen species being produced. due to their training, diet, lifestyle, gear use. So they need to be careful of gear use worsening that oxidative damage because their ROS levels are already quite high. This study backed these findings up. It actually used hydrogen peroxide to induce cell death in female rat brain cells. And the purpose of using hydrogen peroxide is that it creates a condition that mimics the oxidative stress observed in neurodegeneration, like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. Hydrogen peroxide is a reactive oxygen species and is commonly used in research to study oxidative stress mechanisms due to its ability to generate, like I said, a lot of oxidative damage in cells. So they treated these cells, these brain cells, with hydrogen peroxide, and then they could examine how administration of anabolic androgenic steroids like testosterone influenced the death of these cells. And again, they found that if androgens were administered after oxidative stress, cell death was increased. For example, the maximum concentration of hydrogen peroxide and testosterone seen in this graph as HT100 led to the lowest cell viability compared to hydrogen peroxide alone. We're sitting down at 20% cell viability when you have testosterone being introduced after exposure to hydrogen peroxide. However, interestingly, when cells are pre-treated with androgens, it protected against oxidative stress-induced death. In this graph, T plus H outperformed hydrogen peroxide, which is just the H line, in terms of keeping cells alive. Now, looking deeper, androgens can also have other effects in the brain. They reduce levels of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a protein that belongs to the neutrophil family of growth factors, which are crucial for the development, survival, and maintenance of neurons in the brain and the nervous system. Androgens can also reduce the levels of 5-HT, which is serotonin involved in mood, cognitive functioning and sleep, amongst a whole host of other things, and dopamine levels as well. Research has found, and in this study that I'm going to show now, serotonin and dopamine are both reduced in all areas of the brain following stanozolol treatment. Stanozolol is Winstrol or Winnie, and it's very interesting that both dopamine and serotonin are significantly crushed when treated with Winstrol. Anabolic steroids can also reduce NGF, which is nerve growth factor, which is a protein that, like its name suggests, has a very important role in the growth, maintenance, and survival of nerve cells. And having dysregulated NGF has been implicated in a lot of behavioral disturbances and depression itself. And then this study, which looked at how androgens actually induce cell death physically, found that when cells were treated with Debol or methyl testosterone, you had significant cell death. And in this image, all of the orange and red spots in the images are cells that are dying or already dead. And in this graph, you can see that the percentage of live cells significantly dropped from control group when you introduced Dianabol or methyl testosterone. So basically, androgens can exert their neurotoxic effects through two pathways: physical apoptosis, which is physical programmed cell death, or if oxidative stress is already present to a high degree, then it can worsen the cell die-off because of the oxidative stress and reactive oxygen species. So what does this mean practically? It means that the research is showing that it's both concentration dependent and oxidative stress or inflammation dependent, with the neuroprotective effect of androgens seemingly related to the level of inflammation already present or not present, which has a lot of implications for the guys who are already on cycle and who have high levels of oxidative stress, and that stronger compounds like Debol, for example, seem to induce a lot more cell death if the reactive oxygen species are already present, whereas physiological testosterone in the research within normal limits seems to be protective if you can also offset the inflammation. I've done a few other videos on how to reduce reactive oxygen species and inflammation, so check those out on my channel if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching, guys. That is the science of how steroids influence brain chemistry and if they're neurotoxic at all. And the takeaway is they are neurotoxic if you're using very strong, potent compounds, more potent than testosterone, and in the presence of already elevated inflammation and reactive oxygen species in your body that can come through things like heavy bodybuilding training and a lot of muscle protein synthesis and turnover, lifestyle, nutrition, eating, constant eating, and calorie intake, and stress itself. And that testosterone within physiological limits seems to be quite protective, and also that estrogen itself seems to be protective, which is even more reason to be very careful with aromatase inhibitors, and why I don't usually recommend guys on TRT to use it unless you're a complete genetic anomaly and you cannot seem to get your E2 level in check. I don't recommend the use of it because there are a whole host of neurotoxic and other effects that crushing your estrogen can do in the body. So that seems to be the science, guys. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.